Okay, everyone, today we are starting Unit 9, Notes number 1. So we're changing our format with our notes just a little bit. So instead of doing 2 notes on Monday, we're going to do just 1 per week. And so the notes might be a little bit longer. Usually they're 10 to 12 minutes, so these may be closer to like 15, maybe a little bit longer. So we'll do 1 set of notes per week, and you'll have 1 to 2 assignments to go along with those notes to complete during the week. I'll probably assign our key terms next week because I've revamped the notes for this unit, so I might kind of take some key terms off, add some new ones, and you'll also have wraps to do for the week. So since now we're on this modified block schedule for our online learning, you'll also have your wraps to do, but you'll have a wrap for Monday, and then the 2 days that you're checking in. So period 5 will be Tuesday, Thursday, and period 6 will be Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So 3 wraps instead of 5. So all of that starting this week. So Unit 9, Notes number 1, we're now in the 1960s. So these notes are titled The 1960s and Kennedy. So we have the election of 1960, which was between John F. Kennedy, who was a Democrat, and Richard Nixon, who was a Republican. So Richard Nixon was the vice president under Eisenhower. So he had political experience. He was already, technically in the White House because Eisenhower was president during the 1950s. Eisenhower wasn't running again, so now Nixon wants to be president. Kennedy, he was actually like the same age as Nixon, but he just had a much more youthful appearance compared to Nixon. So he was a Democrat. He was a senator from Massachusetts, so he also had political experience. He came from a wealthy Irish Catholic family from Boston, was very charismatic, an inspiring speaker. He fought in World War II. He went to Harvard, so he had a really, good background. And his opponents saw him as being too young, too inexperienced, and too Catholic. So we had never had a Catholic president before him. So Nixon is actually from California. He was born and raised in Whittier. He was the son of poor Quakers, had foreign policy experience and McCarthyism experience. And so he didn't appeal to voters like JFK did. And he had hoped to ride Eisenhower's popularity. And so even when you look at the two of them, like I said, they're basically the same age. I think at the time Kennedy was like 42, Nixon was maybe like 43, 44, but Nixon just has an older look to him. Kennedy represented much more of the new youthful movement. So Republican was Nixon as candidate, and then the Democrat was Kennedy. So Kennedy gets elected. He defeats Nixon by about 100,000 votes. It was a very close election. It was also the first time that we had televised debates. And so what was interesting about the televised debates is that when Kennedy was on, or they're both on there at the same time, Kennedy had makeup put on him. So when you're on TV, sometimes you have to put on some television makeup because of the lights. If not, you looked washed out, whereas Nixon refused it. So Kennedy had a better appearance when he was on TV. So people that saw the debates felt that he had performed better, but people that had listened to the debates on the radio thought Nixon had done better. So when you add in television and also this idea of now you're seeing people, it definitely does change people's perspectives of who they are wanting to vote for. So 2 factors led to JFK's election. One was the debates. Kennedy looked better, spoke better, appeared more presidential, so people favored him. There was also the black folks. This is during the early 1960s. Civil rights is happening. And so Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested in October of 1960. And JFK had called his wife to console her. And so people had heard about that. He appeared to be sympathetic and supportive of the civil rights movement, and so that alone, inspired lots of African Americans to vote for Kennedy. They felt that with him as president, it would help to get the movement going, get some more changes going, where Nixon didn't do anything. So many black voters saw JFK as more of an ally. So part of Kennedy's legacy, which we will talk about in the weeks to come, the Cuban Missile Crisis will happen under him. And he was also seen as an inspiring leader. He had many speeches and phrases that he is known for. So Kennedy's inauguration happened January 20th, 1961. So here he is being sworn in. So the Chief Justice is Earl Warren. And then you can also see his wife, Mrs. Kennedy, is right here. Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson is there. I believe that is Nixon. Nixon is there. He would have been there since he was the outgoing VP. And so the inauguration happens at the Capitol. So it's a huge, huge ordeal. So JFK and Camelot. So many saw Kennedy's young and brilliant White House as Camelot, referring to the mythical King Arthur's Round Table and glamorous court. And so because Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline Kennedy, they were young, they had much more a sense of glamour to them than Ike and his wife did because they were older. And they also had a young family. So they had their daughter Caroline and their son John Jr. So it just brought a whole new youthfulness to the White House that wasn't there before. Mrs. Kennedy, Jacqueline Kennedy, known as Jackie, many people idolized her for her fashion, her glamour, her etiquette, taste, and education. She was a socialite, a debutante, came from a wealthy family. So she knew, I'm trying to think how many languages she could speak. She could speak, besides English, Spanish, Italian, French. She might have even known a little bit of Greek and Latin. So again, just very well educated. She would go out and campaign for her husband and speak to Italians in Italian, speak in Spanish. And so it was just very impressive to people. JFK's youth, charm, and charisma captivated the public and the press. So here are some pictures just kind of showing this new era within the White House. These photos at the bottom, JFK staged them. And so Jackie was very adamant about them having privacy. But he knew that having pictures like this with his young children in the Oval Office, having something like that being out there in a magazine and being published, how much support, people can identify like, oh, the president's a father, he has young kids, so do I. And it just makes them, it humanizes him. So he snuck in a photographer, had these pictures taken when Jackie was not in the White House, but they're very, very iconic. Also, you can see Jackie here. She was known for her fashion. She was a fashion icon of the 1960s. She had designers like Valentino designing for her. She was always a trendsetter with her, whether it was her hairstyle, her clothing. She was also, one of her big projects, usually the first ladies take on some kind of a project, is she revamped the White House, like renovated it. So she felt that it hadn't been taken care of as it should have, being a, national historical monument. So she found, kind of renovated every room, redecorated it, found important historical pieces, made sure that those were on display. Also, you see here these top pictures, the president and his daughter. They had a family house out on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. So they just like being outdoors, going sailing. So they had a very well-rounded life. The best and the brightest. So part of Kennedy's mystique of Camelot was his team of advisors. So they were young, talented, fresh-faced, and forward-thinking. So he didn't surround himself with just kind of the usual old guard of people. He added Harvard professors, business executives, charity executives. He definitely was the type of president who knew that he didn't know everything, so he wanted the best minds to advise him. He wanted the best people behind economists to tell him about the economy. You know, give him what the real reports were. So some of his top advisors were McGeorge Bundy was the National Security Advisor, Robert McNamara was the Defense Secretary, and then his brother, who's pictured up here, Robert Kennedy, was his Attorney General. And so within the Kennedy family, it was a very large family. He had another brother was Ted Kennedy, who became a senator as well. His oldest brother Joe had died in the war, and then he had about like 4 sisters. So it's a very, very large Irish Catholic family. So Kennedy's dad put a lot of pressure on him to make sure that Robert was part of his cabinet. But again, Robert Kennedy went to Harvard. He was well qualified for within those positions. Later on in the later 1960s, Robert Kennedy does become a senator and also runs for president, but he is also assassinated. So JFK's team of young intellectuals motivated young Americans to get involved in society and politics. So once in office, Kennedy begins his push for progress. So his administration was known as the New Frontier. So kind of like when we had Franklin Roosevelt, the New Deal. Kennedy was all about the new frontier, the promise, but kind of progressive stuff we can accomplish, called Americans to become new pioneers. The programs faced These new programs face stiff GOP opposition in Congress. So the GOP is another like nickname for Republicans, the Grand Old Party. So still many of the programs on poverty, the economy, and the space were passed. So this leads to fixing the economy. So by 1960, the U.S. was in recession and unemployment was at 6%. And so when we talk about these type of numbers, so when you talk about today with the COVID-19 coronavirus pandemic, there's talks about unemployment going as high as 20 to 30%. So that is crazy high numbers, crazy high numbers. When we talk about 6%, and even at that, that is still considered high. It gives you kind of perspective of where we're going and just kind of, you know, how high, what a large number that is. So Kennedy employed 2 measures to deal with unemployment during the 1960s. One was deficit spending. So JFK cut taxes to allow Americans to have more income to spend. He also increased defense spending by 20% with submarines, missiles, weaponry. And so when we talk about deficit spending, we're seeing that today with that new pandemic stimulus bill. It means the government is spending money that they don't have. So they are taking out loans to pay for those stimulus checks that are going to be coming out that Congress just passed. So in the same way, JFK allowed the government to take on the debt to cut taxes for Americans. He felt that if Americans could have more money, that will help to keep the economy going. So again, same thought process from what they did then to what we're doing now. There was also job and poverty relief. Kennedy increased the minimum wage to $1.25 an hour to boost consumerism. He also increased unemployment benefits and sent aid to poor cities. So sending foreign aid. Kennedy sent economic and education aid to poor countries to fight the influence of communism. So even though we're in the 1960s, we are still in the middle of the Cold War. We don't want communism to spread. We will send help, send aid to make sure that countries are not succumbing to communism. So some of the programs he created Promoted were the Peace Corps. Over 30,000 college-age volunteers traveled to poor nations to help. Most became teachers, health aides, engineers to help third world countries. And so the idea is you're sending out young adults. They're going to help establish countries, help to get their educational system going, just lending a helping hand. So the Peace Corps allowed for lots of young Americans to go out into the world, to travel, and to just volunteer. The Alliance for Progress, JFK sent $12 billion to Latin America to build better trade and deter communism from developing. And so right here you see Kennedy's face on a Colombian, I think that's a stamp. I don't think that's mine. I think that's a stamp. But the idea is that they were grateful for the help that we were providing them, and the type of assistance that we were giving them. So education and space. In 1962, Kennedy boldly states that the U.S. will beat the Soviets to the moon. This is known as the space race. So NASA and the space race. So JFK boosts funding to the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. Within months, an American, Alan Shepard, is in space and a moon program is on. So Kennedy was adamant that the U.S. would win this space race, that we would put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. So, spoiler alert, in 1969, NASA does land Apollo 11 on the moon. It's what Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and I believe the other guy is Michael Collins. They land on the moon, and they have the famous saying, I can't think of it right now, but like one step for mankind. I know, really bad, but I'll look it up and I'll tell you guys later. So boosts in education. JFK's ambitious space challenge sees increased funding in scholarships and university research. Math and science programs take off. So ultimately we want students to study in these fields, math and science, because that is directly related to space research, even things like defense research. And so we want to have strong people in those areas to help boost America in that respect. So again, still heavily part of the Cold War and which side we're trying to make sure America comes out on top. So this is the end of the notes. I won't have key terms for you guys until next week. Make sure you're doing your raps. I'll probably post your raps tomorrow. No, I should post your raps today. And just take your time throughout the week. Make sure you're completing your assignments. I'll probably have another, either send out a check-in video, or we'll probably do kind of an optional Zoom later on this week. So that way if you guys have any questions, we can go over those.